We'll be looking at the text in a moment, and if you can split your screen or you are able to print it out, it might be easier for you to be able to reference it. I'm trying to balance keeping the FaceTime with also screen sharing, so but we'll make it work. All right, welcome everybody. So this is the first of 4 sessions in a course called What is God? Perspectives from the 20th Century. We're going to look at 4 different thinkers, one each week. We're going to try to do justice to their body of work in 45 minutes, which I will do as much as I can to honor their work as a whole, but we'll only be able to do so much in 45 minutes. What the goal is here is to give you a chance to explore 4 perspectives of 20th century Jewish theologians and looking at their understanding of what God is, to try to give each of us in this conversation a chance to explore different models for thinking about God, which I think is an important thing for human being and religious soul to do. And we'll take a look at that today. Today, we're going to be looking at some text from Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel. Rabbi Heschel was a 20th century theologian. He was born in 1907. He died in 1972. He got his early training in Europe and was fortunate to, after he was teaching in Germany, he was deported to Poland in the 30s, and he got lucky enough to get out to the States in the 40s. He taught 5 years at Hebrew Union College in Cincinnati, and then from 1945 until 1972, he taught at the Jewish Theological Seminary in New York. Any rabbi ordained from the mid-40s to the mid-70s in the conservative movement studied with Abraham Joshua Heschel, and those who studied after at the seminary studied with his students. And so he was very influential, especially in the conservative movement in North America. But also he is read widely in Jewish circles and Christian circles in the United States, especially Protestant circles. And he's had a big influence on theology in America today. And I must say, given the current events, I just want to note, part of why we're doing this online learning is because we're all in some stage of quarantine. Hope everyone on the call is healthy and their family is healthy. But we're also in recent days feeling, I don't even have the words for it. There are all the emotions that come with the protests and the violence that has erupted in our country about coexistence and race relations in America. Abraham Joshua Heschel was central to the civil rights movement. One of the most famous pictures of him is marching with Martin Luther King. He talked a lot about how the social action that he did and the justice he pursued was the best way to make his Torah come alive. And to a certain extent, he might say to us, why are you reading my theology text today? You should be going out and making a statement about the injustice that's happening in our country instead of sitting at home on your computer, talking about theology today. Better to bring it alive. And I thought I might mention that, just given there's a whole other piece of Heschel's work. So to transition into the text that we're going to look at, I want you to each do if you have a pen and paper near you, you could do a short reflective writing exercise, or it can be mental if you're not in the mood to write it down. But I find the process of jotting down a few sentences helpful in warming up your mind and your thinking. What I'd like each of you to do is spend a few moments thinking about, and if you can, writing about a moment in your life when you felt God's presence the strongest. Try to describe that. I want to give you 3 minutes to jot down some notes about that. And after we come back from a little quiet individual writing reflection, we'll ask for volunteers for 2 or 3 people to share their reflections before we move into Heschel's thought. So again, write about a moment in your life where you felt God's presence the strongest. I'll give you 3 minutes starting now. If you're interested in sharing your moment briefly with the group so we can hear some examples of what people came up with, note that in the chat. And Julie, who is a fine facilitator of video lessons, will recognize a couple of you who volunteer and unmute you to be able, so we can hear what you wrote. Anybody interested in sharing?
Someone shared in the chat, when first discovering the blessing of song quoted in Rabbi Reuven Hammer's book, Entering Jewish Prayer, 4 years ago. This is Catherine said. And then I discovered it in Mishkan Tefillah, Nishmat Kochai, and Mi Kamocha earlier this year in March. One of the most beautiful things I've ever read. And a couple people have offered to share. So we'll hear from Bruce and then from Sherry. Bruce, I'm going to unmute you now. You're unmuted. But you still need to unmute yourself on your end.
Okay, got it.
Great.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes. Hi, Bruce.
Okay. Hi. Well, one Friday night years ago, I was coming back from Long Island to New York City, and driving, and it was terrible rain. It was really frightening. Maybe I was going a little faster than I should, but my car began to swerve. I was in the right lane of a 2-lane highway, and in the middle was a guardrail, and my car swerved all the way from the right to about inches from the guardrail and stopped. And of course, at that point, I said, oh my God. I just felt very lucky to be alive. And that's when I felt close to God at that particular point.
Thank you, Bruce, for sharing that. Do we have one more? Julie, is there someone else who volunteered? No, Julie, you're muted.
I'm muted. Sherry, you're unmuted. Sherry?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. My dad was in the hospital and my daughter was studying in Malta, and we were bringing her home because the doctors said that he probably would not recover. So we're waiting for her to come, and all my other kids were there and some family. And my dad suddenly had a seizure, and he just started turning blue. I called for help, and then I kind of collapsed and started praying that he couldn't die then, because my daughter, I wanted my daughter to be able to say goodbye. So somehow they came in with all the machines. I went out into the hall. A nurse kind of grabbed me in the days when people could grab each other in a hug. And I finally went back in the room, and they said, we've got him. He's okay. You know, he might not wake up and be able to talk, but he's alive. And they later said he had to be moved to hospice, which we did. It was a lovely, lovely hospice. And by the time my daughter got there, we got to hospice. And it was the strangest thing, because Jennifer was just standing there, and this light flooded the room. I mean, this light flooded the room, and my dad looked at her like he was surprised that she was there. And it was like one of those times when you feel like God heard me, and God really answered this prayer, because it was so important that she had traveled so far to just get there and say goodbye.
Thank you for sharing that. Thank you. Julie, we have one more.
Liz Ornstein, you're unmuted.
Okay, so my daughter, who just got married at the age of 26, we adopted her. Thank you. Literally 2 weeks ago, we adopted her at the age of 8 months from China, and on March 15th, 1994, we were going to adopt internationally. I didn't know where from, possibly China. I had a dream, which if I believed in visions, I would call it a vision, but I don't, so I'll call it a dream. And it was the face of a little Asian girl, maybe 18 months old. Fast forward, I thought maybe it's her birthday. Suffice it to say, the first referral we got, we couldn't take, all kinds of stuff. But eventually, I went to China. I got her, Sarah, and the last night before we left, I had read about people dreaming about the baby on their birthday. It's not her birthday. So the last night before we left, we got some paperwork that we had to review. And one of the papers was the baby's story. And the baby's story said that Wei Jun, which is her Chinese name, was found in a suburb of Hefei on March 15th, 1994. And I just about lost it. It was not what I expected. And I don't know how to explain that, except that somehow or other, she was never without a mother. Somehow we connected. And to me, that's a God moment. I don't know how else to explain.
Okay, thank you for that. Thanks everybody who shared. We heard 3 very personal stories, 3 very personal moments. One, an escape by inches from accident. One about the beginning of life, one about the end of life. Different human moments where people felt close to God. Wanted everyone to be able to think about their own moment as a way into our conversation about Abraham Joshua Heschel. Because as we'll see, where Heschel starts is with our experience. And we'll take a look at some texts, and I hope that this exercise will play into a little bit what Heschel is talking about. We're going to read selections today from Heschel's book, Man is Not Alone. The subtitle of that book is A Philosophy of Religion. And while there are sections of it that feel very Jewish, there's a way in which this is a book about religion and not exclusively Jewish. And these ideas that Heschel speaks of in this book that we'll talk about today have appealed to both Jewish readers and non-Jewish readers. Other works of Heschel feel more deeply Jewish, but this is definitely a Jewish work, but it also has a much broader universal appeal to that. So I want to transition from that exercise, and we'll come back to it a little bit as we look at some of the text into the first text. I'm going to share my screen to bring up the text for those of you who don't have the document. And I'm going to ask for a volunteer to read the passage that I'm going to put up on the screen. And Julie will help facilitate finding that volunteer. Julie, can we see the screen?
Yes, we can. And I'm reposting the document in the chat box too.
Great. Is there someone who volunteered to read this first quotation? The titles of the paragraphs are mine. I posed a number of questions. So this starts with the question, where do we find God? This is a sentence or two that's Heschel's answer to that.
Great. Wendy has volunteered to read.
Thank you, Wendy.
The ineffable inhabits the magnificent and the common, the grandiose and the tiny facts of reality alike. Some people sense this quality at distant intervals in extraordinary events. Others sense it in ordinary events, in every fold, in every nook, day after day, hour after hour.
All right, thank you, Wendy.
You're welcome.
So this, I'm just coming back to you. This quotation, I think it's a good transition for us from the experience that we had before. If we had time for everyone on the video call to share, we would have heard lots of different moments. What Heschel notes here is that some feel God's presence in the magnificent moments. Could be, you know, after that hike to the top of the mountain, or the beautiful rainbow, or the miraculous event. And some feel that God's presence in the common everyday moment, a glimpse of a small flower in a patch of weeds, or just a moment of quiet and a tumultuous day. Everyone has a different sort of sense of where we find God and how we find God. And we heard a few examples of that in our conversation before. But Heschel acknowledges that each of us will have those moments in different times and different places. And that's that first quote. All right, I'm going back to the text, and we'll look at a second passage. Again, we're going to ask for a volunteer to read. And here comes the text. And here my document seems to have scrolled. So question number 2, how do we become aware of God? Here's Heschel's answer. Do we have a volunteer? Well, there are 2 passages we're going to read here. Do we have a volunteer for the first one?
Great. Nola, you are
Thanks, Nola.
unmuted.
Okay.
Will you read for us, Nola? In thinking on the level, can you see my screen? Oh, we may have lost Nola.
How, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. In thinking on the level of the ineffable, we do not set out with a preconceived idea of a supreme being in our possession, trying to ascertain whether God is in reality the way God is in our minds. The awareness which opens our minds to the existence of a supreme being is an awareness of reality, an awareness of a divine presence. Long before we attain any knowledge of God's essence, we possess an intuition of a divine presence.
All right, thank you, Nola. I'm gonna stay on the screen because we're gonna go to another text in a moment. But I just want to note, I hope you're hearing the echoes in this paragraph with the experience we had with the reflection exercise that we did. In thinking about moments when people felt closest to God, what people described as a moment of feeling God's presence. God's presence in the room, God's presence in the events. That phenomenon that was within the descriptions that people provided is here described by Heschel. Right? We don't start with an idea of what God is. We start with an intuition of what it feels like to encounter God. And that's a route into Heschel's theology. We're going to build on that with one more source, which I just scrolled down to. Do we have a volunteer to read this one?
Would anyone like to read? Yes, we have a volunteer.
All right.
So
I like hearing Heschel out loud because it's so poetic. Hearing the words out loud, it gives it an extra layer in addition to just reading it. So go ahead, Julie. Who's going to read for us?
go ahead, Kate.
The great insight is not attained when we ponder or infer the beyond from the here. In the realm of the ineffable, God is not a hypothesis derived from logical assumptions, but an insight, self-evident as light. When the ultimate awareness comes, it is a flash arriving all at once.
Okay, thank you for that. I'm going to join you back on screen. Here we go. Does anyone have any thoughts or responses to these paragraphs that we just read from Heschel, or any questions about what Heschel's saying here? Heschel, sometimes you have to read slowly and ponder a little bit. So I don't want to move through it too fast. Anybody have a thought in response or a question? Okay. I gave it the teacher count silently for a few seconds to give people time to think.
We do have one comment.
Oh, there you go.
Kate says, I feel like he captured what my experience has been that I've had a hard time putting into words.
Thank you, Kate. I do think one of, while Heschel's words are sometimes hard to understand, he uses a lot of jargon and a lot of language. And then you have to unpack it. But so Kate, I like your response there that he gave words to what you were thinking, right? What Heschel's saying here is, and actually I just got a private chat from Bruce who said, it sounds like it just comes to you rather than you searching for God. And that's in fact, Bruce, you summed it up really well. Heschel says, right, the encounter with God comes to you and you notice it and you become aware of it. It's not about being on a lifelong quest. In fact, his next book, which we're not going to look at today, but his Philosophy of Judaism book is called God in Search for Man. Heschel's theology says, Jewish theology says, God is actually searching for us as opposed to us searching for God. That might be a session for a different day, but Bruce, you hit it on the nail with that. The experience of God is not something necessary that you seek out. It happens to you. Although Heschel would say you have to be attuned to it, because Heschel would say there are many people who have a moment that could be a moment that's an awareness of God, but something that gets in the way of their seeing it or hearing it. All right, Julie, we have some comments. Go ahead.
Yes, Lisa.
Thanks. I love Heschel, and I feel like I totally relate to what he's saying, and in particular here, and also in the Radical Amazement, which I think we'll read next. But I feel that this is almost counter to what I learned as a child, that I was told what God is, right? We learned in Hebrew school, and particularly maybe in Sunday school, God is this and God does that, and we were, God was described and explained. So I feel that's almost counter what Heschel is saying here, that I did set out with a preconceived idea, most of which I rejected and then discovered, hopefully discovered on my own. So it's just interesting that he was so instrumental in, in our theology, yet I didn't get that as a young Hebrew school impressionable child.
Yeah. Lisa, thank you for that. I think many of us first encounter God and learn about God in synagogue, in school, through the Bible, through the Siddur. And sometimes the images that are presented in those classrooms or those texts aren't ones that speak to our everyday experience. And sometimes that puts up a barrier. So some people learn in school, God does, in Hebrew school, like you said, God is A, B, C, and D. And over life, sometimes in adolescence, you say, God is not A, B, C, and D, and maybe you walk away from it. What I like about Heschel's theology is there's a more openness to it, allowing for the self-description of the encounter. How Heschel resolves the tension then between the Torah, which presents certain images of God, to this, that's maybe another session, because I do think, Heschel does talk about how our ancient ancestors did come to know God through certain collective experiences, which they tried to pass on to us, and those echoes of those voices could still influence us today. But I think Heschel would not want, especially with anyone, but especially with children, but adults too, instruction about God to be so closed that says, this is God, take it or leave it. Because sometimes people might leave it, and he wouldn't want that to happen, but instead wants people to be attuned to where they see and hear about God themselves. So thank you for that comment, Lisa. Let's take one more comment and then we'll go to the next text. But Julie, do we have someone who's waiting?
Michael.
Go ahead, Michael.
Hi, thank you for leading this session. I just wanted to kind of think about what Heschel would say to people who feel like they haven't ever had that experience of this experience that he's describing. I've had that experience, and obviously other people haven't described it, but I've encountered a number of people in my life and in my family who say, I don't know what you're talking about, or people who need to describe it through logic or through other lenses, right? I just wonder, is this something that everyone experiences? Is that part of the argument? And also, I guess in the context of the divine, is this open to more than just Jews?
Those are great questions, Michael. So Heschel would say definitely open to more than just Jews, although he would say that Judaism has a particular response to the experience of God. And I think, look, I've done a lot of teaching of Heschel with teens in high school, some of whom say, oh, I've had these moments, and some of whom say, never had these moments. Right? And when you're dealing with, 16, 17, 18-year-olds who have, just the beginning of their life experience under their belts, they have a more limited number of years to, have these moments and experiences. What Heschel would say is that spirituality is a basic human need, right? You have to breathe, you have to eat, you have to drink to take care of, you have to sleep to take care of physical needs. You also have to tend to your soul. And if you do, you could be open to these experiences. He also talks a lot about how society can be a barrier to the encounter with God. And we'll come back to that in a few more texts. I want to pause on that a little bit, but we'll circle back to that in a second. All right. I want to move on to the next text because I know I want to honor everyone was good about coming at 3 when we started. I want to make sure we end at close to 3:45 as we promised. Although Heschel, we could talk about for years. I'm going to share my screen again and see if we can have a volunteer to read the next passage. What does belief in God look like? I'm going to pull that text up. Here it comes. There we go. This one's a little longer. Do we have a volunteer to read? All right. If because of the time, Julie, if there's no volunteers, would you mind reading this one?
Sure. Actually, Sherry has volunteered.
Thanks, Sherry.
Okay. Yeah. What we encounter in our perception of the sublime, in our radical amazement, is a spiritual suggestiveness of reality, an elusiveness to transcendent meaning. The world in its grandeur is full of a spiritual radiance for which we have neither name nor concept. We are struck with an awareness of the immense preciousness of being, a preciousness which is not an object of analysis, but a cause of wonder. It is inexplicable, nameless, and cannot be specified or divided into categories. Yet we have a certainty without knowledge. It is read without being expressible. Wow.
All right. Thank you for that. There's a lot to chew on in these paragraphs here. Heschel here, I think, is saying there are 2 important things that are key to Heschel's thinking that he shares here. The first, I think Lisa referenced before, is the term radical amazement. That's an important phrase for Heschel, and one that if you've been exposed to Heschel, we've heard quotes, it's often one of Heschel's big oft-quoted phrases to say that we have to have radical amazement, not just regular amazement, but radical amazement. In response to these moments of the encounter with God, it leads us to this radical state of amazement where we see the world in a different way. And the phrase I love in the second paragraph that's connected to that, there's something about that experience that gives us a certainty without knowledge. And to me, this is one of the important ideas, concepts in Heschel in thinking about God, although I do think it's one that can be most challenged to the objections or the challenges that Michael raised in the last question. This moment of the encounter with God, whether it's right after the accident or in that moment of sunlight in the hospital room where ailing father is able to connect with his granddaughter the last time, or sometimes in the, after hiking up to the summit and seeing the beautiful view, or after the birth of a child, or whatever those moments are. There's something in this moment that makes you appreciate the world and have some transcendent experience that makes you certain, without knowledge, that you've encountered God and that there is this spiritual realm that you've become aware of beyond. And for Heschel, what's important about this is the certainty is not certainty that comes from knowledge. It's a certainty that comes from the experience. We live in Western society in a world that relies on logic and reason and proof. Right? A lot of what, I imagine, we all share in our educational backgrounds is that, to understand the world and how it works, to understand science and how it works, it's important to have proof, the scientific method, and knowledge helps us understand the world. And we value that. Heschel says there's another category, though, that's outside of this knowledge. That's the certainty we have without knowledge. And while he doesn't say it in this paragraph, I think that's what, at least I see in Heschel as what he describes as faith as. Right? Faith is being certain of something when you have no knowledge of it. Right? I can say myself as a person, I am certain of the existence of God, but I don't have a proof that I can show you. I don't have proof that I can show you. I can't totally explain it to you. I just know from my own experiences of radical amazement, to keep it within Heschel's frame, that there is God, that there is something indescribable about the world that I encounter in my experience of it, and I'm certain of it. And that certainty comes not from knowledge. There's other certainty that comes from knowledge. There are other things I believe I know because of knowledge and reason and proof. But for Heschel, it comes from experience and not from knowledge. Responses, thoughts, or comments to this paragraph, or my comments on it? I have a comment from Nancy who quotes, here's a famous quote, not from Heschel, right? There are no atheists in foxholes. Is that certainly different? There are, right? There's moments, when I think about that phrase, there are no atheists in foxholes, right? In the midst, when you're in the foxhole in the midst of battle and war, lots of people turn to faith and prayer in that, in the extreme circumstances that you're in. I think Heschel would say there are authentic moments then and inauthentic moments then. There are people who might choose to pray to hedge their bets. That's a theology that says, I don't believe in God, but, while I was fighting in the Vietnam War, I chose to pray to God because I figured if there was one, might as well hedge my bets and pray so that I could be protected. That's not Heschel's approach. I think Heschel would say, in foxholes, and all kinds of other holes and all kinds of other moments, you can have that moment of radical amazement. But I don't think he means by it what that quote does. Julie, do we have anybody else who's waiting?
Nola says the idea of experiential certainty outside of knowledge and analysis, reflecting that back. And we do have one person who would like to comment. Liz, you're unmuted.
Please, Liz. You might have to unmute yourself too.
Okay. Yeah, I'm just going to echo. I think it was Kate who said this. The experience that I described, I have been aware of for 25 years, and I never, ever had words for it. And these words just fit so perfectly. And there's just something about the idea that it's that they're different experiences, but that it's an experience that other people have. It's just perfect. I love it.
Oh, nice. Thank you. And I think I want to compare this comment with what I think Liz said before, though I might have the wrong name, sorry. You came to this experience, you had this experience, and Heschel gave words to it or described it. Right? Heschel would say it's an experience that many people have, but it's one that came from experience, not from someone that told you in a classroom that this is how it was going to work, and then you went and did it. It was part of life, and now Heschel's describing this phenomenon that gives language potentially to talk about how we find God in those moments. And for Heschel, it's what we experience at those moments that is God. And maybe instead of the definitions of God you may have learned in Hebrew school or someplace else.
I think the word certainty is so right on. It's just like, yes, I know this.
Yeah, I agree. For me, one of the moments that I turn back to for that moment of certainty was that brief couple of seconds where I went from being a person without children to a person with children. We had twins first, so within 14 minutes I went from 0 children to 2. But if you're a parent and you've had this experience of holding a newborn child, you know how the world reorients itself as soon as your child is born. And you have this certainty about your obligations for this other human being. You have certainty about new priorities that totally changes from that moment and that experience. Some of that is a new awareness that comes in that moment. And I think there are lots of moments where you can have it. And for some, it's at the birth of a child. For some, it's at other kinds of experiences as well. All right, I want to go to the last text. I'm gonna share my screen one more time, and I'll read this last text to you. The question on the page for those who are looking at it is, and you all see it in a moment, is how can we begin to look for God? Right? If some of our experience of God is based on experiences that we have, what if we want to seek out these experiences and have them more? This is some of the advice Heschel would have. So I'm going to read it and give you a little commentary, and then we'll take some closing comments. Part company with the preconceived notions. Suppress your learning to reiterate and to know in advance of your seeing. Try to see the world for the first time with eyes not dimmed by memory or volition, and you will detect that you and the things that surround you, trees, birds, chairs, are like parallel lines that run close and never meet. Your pretense of being acquainted with the world is quickly abandoned. So here I think Heschel is saying, is trying to describe how knowledge and familiarity and the pretense that we have that we understand the way things work stop us from seeing the part of the world, the part of existence that gives us a glimpse of God's presence. Once we know something, we have a tendency to be less amazed by it, and then the chance that we will be radically amazed disappears. And as I come back to you on the screen, I'll give you an example of that. I think about seeing a rainbow in the sky. Once you become aware of the physics of the rainbow is the bending of light through the moisture in the air that happens after the rain, you might not be as inspired or in awe of the rainbow as much once you understand how it works. And Heschel says that sometimes our knowledge, our preconceived notions of the world, the fact that we think we understand how things work, get in the way of us noticing that which will lead us to radical amazement. And he asks us if we want to nurture our spiritual side, and in part this is maybe a response to Michael's question before. What Heschel says is we have to put aside our preconceived notions and try to see the world as if we're seeing it for the first time. The best way to do this sometimes is to take a walk with a 4-year-old and ask them to describe what they're seeing, because 4-year-olds are natural students of Heschel, because they're still seeing the world and much of it for the first time, and they notice little things that we just walk by and are in awe and amazement of in those moments. Heschel would advise us to try to put aside what we think we know, put aside the ways in which we can explain how things work, and have that raw exposure of the world. And that's a route to becoming amazed, to sitting in wonder, and opening ourselves up to finding God and the experience of God. So we've reached 3:45, and we have done what I would call is a sprint through the first chapters of Heschel's Man is Not Alone as an attempt to get a flavor of what Heschel has to say. If you're interested in Heschel, if this piqued your interest, Man is Not Alone is not a bad place to start. Many people's first read of Heschel is his book called The Sabbath, which is much shorter and a little easier to read. It talks more about Shabbat than about theology. And if you want to read a biography of Heschel and his work and an overview of his work, my friend and colleague Rabbi Shai Held of Machlon Hadar has written a biography about. It's a little bit biography. It's more of a summary of Heschel's theology. You have to be good at tough academic reading because you might chip a tooth on this. But Rabbi Held has done a phenomenal job at trying to present Heschel's theology on a secondhand basis in his biography. Those are some sources to potentially go to. I know that this chat room is being used for other stuff later. I think, though, we could take one or two closing comments if we can. Yeah, I mean, if someone has them. Some quick closing comments.
What's Shai Held's book called? I'm going to put in the
I meant to grab it from my bookshelf. I just turned on my camera for a second to go to Rabbi Google. It's called Abraham Joshua Heschel, The Call of Transcendence.
And we do have one final comment or question from Barry. Go ahead, Barry.
Thank you for the class today. I appreciate you touching on biography when it comes to Heschel in brief, because I know we're down to just the last few even seconds possibly. Can you summarize in a sentence or two how you feel that Heschel's life shaped his theology, or vice versa, how his theology shaped his life?
That's a big one. Yeah, Heschel began as a Bible scholar. His dissertation was about the prophets. And I think it was his deep reading of the prophetic books of the Bible that woke Heschel up. And in some ways, people call him a prophet in the 20th century. I think living with Isaiah and Jeremiah and Ezekiel and their words and the way in which they stood up, saying what was sometimes popular and what was sometimes unpopular to shake people out of their comfort zones to do what's right in the world, was a calling for Heschel. And as he came to the States and really, became a teacher of rabbis in the post-World War II era, he was really motivated to stand up, at the podium on the soapbox, and to shout out in the prophetic way, we have to do what's right and what's just, and we can't let that step, we can't settle for less than that. And it was the prophetic voice in the prophets and how it echoes the prophetic voice in the Torah that really motivated Heschel to get out and not just write and not just teach, but to be active in the world. One of his famous quotes, and maybe this is a good place to end, is, he talked about walking with Martin Luther King. He felt like his feet were praying. And to students at the seminary in the 60s during the civil rights movement, He was, while many professors said, this is a time for you to study Torah while you're in seminary to be the best rabbi that you can, Heschel pushed students to get out into the world. He wanted them to study and be knowledgeable, but said, how can we sit in the ivory tower when there's so much injustice that we have to act on? And some of that came from the certainty that Heschel had without knowledge, that we have to go out and make the world the place that God created it to be. And we have to do that through social action and social activism. And, so in brief, that's my take on that. I have a brief note from Steve about, what, look, I think Heschel today would be out there speaking. There are many, I think there's a testament to, as I saw from, my friends and colleagues, I have many who are rabbis who are out with their congregations, cleaning up destroyed shops and at nonviolent protests throughout the country. Heschel would say this is a time to pray with our feet and make ourselves counted in a way that's, socially distanced and safe. We have the dual threat where it's a hard time to protest because of fears of illness. We're dealing with lots of pieces, but I think the mandate to do something to try to change our society would be right there for Heschel today.